very, very warm welcome to all of you to the 2020 Founders Forum HealthTech London Tech Week Connect event. Little did we know that this would be an event which we would not be attending in person with each other just 12 months ago. My name is Dr. Jack Kreindler. I have the privilege now for the 6th year of being the chair of Founders Forum HealthTech, an event which was started through the Founders Forum network with Brent Hoberman and team. And it is a great privilege to be chairing this event again, albeit slightly shorter and virtual than usual. I was reflecting back on 12 months ago, and unlike quite a lot of conferences and meetups, we always try to hold what we've done to account in the last 12 months. And I think some of the actions that we had set ourselves this time last year included improving the way that we communicate. And I hope that this example of how internationally we can all overcome the inability to meet each other is an example of that. My experience of the last 3 months has been life-changing. I'm sure it has been at least that for many other people as well. And I do quite clearly remember at the very beginning of February being on a rather silly event, a challenge, if you like, trying to run 7 marathons in 7 continents in 77 hours, trying to beat the world record by over 118 hours, and taking off from Antarctica, of all places, after the first marathon, starting to model out the number of cases of this novel coronavirus that were appearing outside of the Wuhan area of China, and realizing that probably by the time I got home 3.5 days later, after South America, North America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australasia visited in that short period of time, that those were going to be the very, very last flights that I was going to take for a foreseeable future. And that story did unfold, as we all well know. How has that changed healthcare? In my own practice, it has completely changed everything that we do. We have gone from being a very physical institution to being a very virtual one. We've gone from practice to research with a global study cohort overnight, something I would never have thought was possible. We have gone literally from a BC moment to an AD moment, in my view, before computers and after digital. And I think that's one of the themes that a lot of you will have heard about, is how radically computation, digitization, and global interaction in real time has changed the way we work and changed what we thought was possible and acceptable from living in a world where we don't necessarily have the opportunity to shake hands, hug, and do all the things that we're used to face. WhatsApp has become, for my UCL Medical School alumni group, not a means of asking which door of the pub we should meet at, but which dose of the drug we should give people. It is an example truly of how something which maybe wasn't around or as used or as accepted 10 years ago has made it possible for us to learn at an extraordinarily fast pace what works and what doesn't. Sometimes well and sometimes with fake news, but on the whole, transformatively helping us really get a grip of what we should be doing in this very interesting time. When asked by Brent and team to put together an afternoon of conversation and debate, the usual kind of topics appeared, which were, well, we've got to talk about the drugs, and we've got to talk about the vaccines, and we've got to talk about whether this works or that works, or should we get antibody tests, and what tech can we use to monitor people at home. And those conversations are happening, and I think they're very worthwhile. But what we wanted to do, as well as covering, which we do in the first topic, the concept of the pharmaceutical industry's transformation because of this time is also look around the subject of coronavirus and not just talk about it directly. And so with that, we have three very interesting sessions that follow the future of pharma, and they are around diseases that are neglected. Pandemics are usually neglected until they start happening, but there are many other diseases from around the world which we should have learned from and which we still mustn't ignore. That will be followed then by a session which we've named COVID Unplugged, which is all about how we mentally need to still keep and maintain our mental health, and maybe take a lot more, pay a lot more attention to the mental health pandemics that have always been there and have only come to the fore even more so in the last 3 months. And finally, we will also have an amazing session, which I'm very much looking forward to, about the power and therapeutic effect of music, which is something which I'm sure a lot of us have listened to a lot more of now we've had the time to be a bit more on our own. Before we roll into the first session, of course, I have to thank our partners and sponsors, Havas Health and You, WSGR, and also not forgetting the often missed people who make this all happen behind the scenes, who we will thank at the end as well. And before I hand over to Thomas Clozel, my friend and founder of Owkin, for the first session on the future of pharma, I thought we would play you a little show reel made by one of our partners, our sponsors, Havas Health and You, that illustrates where we are in the state of the art of the pharmaceutical world, but not only talking about and illustrating the science and mechanisms of action of particular drugs, but also the state of the art in how we communicate these important topics. And communication, of course, as I said at the beginning, I think is something that is equally important in the transformation of science, medicine, and healthcare. It's not just the tech, it's not just the molecules, it's also the way we talk about it. So over to the video, and then over to you, Thomas.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the London Tech Week. Very happy to be here. And thank you, Jack, for inviting us. Really glad to be here to speak about the future of pharma. As you know, COVID has changed the health paradigm. We all think in health in different manner. We think about prevention in a different manner. We think about data and collaboration between researchers in a completely different way. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Owkin, which is a company that tries to create a new research environment, having people collaborating without sharing the data. The data stays on premise. It's a new technology called federated learning. And for me, this is the future of pharma and health. And I'm very happy to have today two amazing guests. We have Vivek Ramaswamy, who is the CEO of Roivant. Roivant being an extremely innovative company trying to develop in parallel a lot of drugs that were abandoned by other pharma, and has been extremely successful, as everyone knows, with one of the biggest IPO with Owkin last year on Alzheimer. Happy to have Vivek on board today, and he will speak about the future of his pharma and how he invents medicine every day. And we have Haseeb Ahmad, who is the director, the managing director of Novartis, UK and Ireland. And Haseeb doesn't need to be presented. Everyone knows him in the UK, but Novartis has been extremely forward in making a very fast digital transformation, having some very interesting efforts in trying to build the future of health, regrouping data sets, building very strong AI teams, and really like being at the forward of what the future of health will be. So I think we're going to try to understand what will be the pharma tomorrow, how it changed with this COVID pandemic. But let's start by asking Vivek and Haseeb what they think is the future of pharma today. So to you, Haseeb, how the COVID crisis and how all this paradigm is changing has changed your opinion about the future of pharma that you know so well.
Great, thank you, Thomas, and good afternoon. I think maybe even be good morning to you. Firstly, thank you for allowing me to join this session. As you said, I'm country president of Novartis here in the UK, so I'm responsible for the strategic direction of Novartis here in the UK. I'm not a scientist, physician, a technologist, but I am someone who's spent 20 years in this industry and is just hugely passionate about the impact that life sciences can have on humanity, but also on society in the broader sense. If there's one positive that's come out of COVID, COVID in many ways has been a really positive shot in the arm, I think, for the life sciences sector. If we consider many of the decisions that many of the people participating in this conference are taking today or have been taking in the last 3 or 4 weeks, or indeed last couple of months, these decisions are almost like a sliding doors moment, I think, for our industry. I think in the future, we'll look back at today and say, this was a sliding doors moment that set us on a new trajectory as an industry, as a sector, that enabled us to discover, develop medicines much faster, but more importantly, or just as importantly, be much more effective actually getting those medicines into the hands and homes of patients. I hope that I'm going to share kind of some reflections in the Q&A as well on what I've seen in the first few months in terms of how COVID's going to impact on medium to long-term medicine and patient care. Novartis is, we've got a couple of hundred development projects, clinical development projects online right now. And unashamedly, I believe we're one of the most exciting companies when it comes to look, not just our pipeline, but what we're doing with our pipeline to discover and develop these medicines. We believe really passionately in the power of collaboration. Again, one positive thing I think from COVID-19 is that the industry has been more united and collaborated in a way like it isn't evident before. We've really kind of reinvented what collaboration looks like. As we are a more outward-looking companies, we work with leaders in data, digital, and AI in both the drug discovery and development space. Another part of what I'm passionate about that I'd like to discuss today is the UK. The UK life science sector is really vibrant. As the company, we support everything from really cutting edge partnerships with NHS England all the way through to new startups who have the potential to revolutionize healthcare. I think Vivek will probably kind of articulate this more eloquently, but if you look at what we're doing in drug discovery and development today versus 10 years ago and what will happen in 10 years' time, we really are pushing on frontiers that we don't ever have dreamt about. Probably one area that I will talk on a little bit about later is about what Novartis is doing in the space of implementation science. So I think one thing that people are familiar with pharmaceutical companies is that we do the typical kind of phase 3, phase B studies looking at clinical safety and efficacy of our medicines. What we're increasingly doing now is implementation science, where we're not just looking at the clinical efficacy of a product, we're actually looking at the implementation and the care pathway. So, some of the endpoints that we're looking at is when we assess a product is looking at its real world utility. Is it better delivered by a pharmacist with a particular pathway versus a nurse versus a physician? Some of the endpoints we're looking at are physician, patient preference. So we're looking much more broadly at system impact of our medicines. And maybe just a couple of points just to close off and then hand over back to you and to Vivek. Alongside my role as leading Novartis in the UK, I'm very pleased and proud actually to be the president and the chairman of the board of the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. Through COVID, I've been really proud of how the industry's really pulled together. It's my role to be a cheerleader for the UK's vibrant life sciences sector, but what we're seeing right now, particularly in drug development, is a really tech-enabled operations that are really kind of coming to the fore, really progressive actions from the MHRA, our regulator here in the UK. And one of the great things we hear from the NHS is the term digital by default. That going forward, almost in every aspect of the healthcare value chain, there's a real desire to kind of embrace digital, not go back to some of our old ways of working. I think, and after the initial kind of shock of this pandemic, as things are starting to subside, I'm really looking forward to kind of debating what the future holds. So with that, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Haseeb. Vivek, do you want to give us a word about your vision of the future of pharma? What happened today?
Absolutely. I thought that was a great start, and I'll just build on a few points that Haseeb made, and then we can continue the rest in the Q&A with you, Thomas. So I guess I'll start pretty high level, and then we can get into more specifics in Q&A. But the way I look at the world is, I think COVID-19, even across industries for a second, and then I'll really bring it to pharma specifically, but across industries was really just accelerating certain trends that already existed prior to COVID-19. And so I don't think of COVID-19 as changing the direction that pharma industry or even other industries were already going, but it's really rather, it's kind of like the kerosene that you throw on flames that were already burning or beginning to burn in every one of those industries. And I think that one that's probably familiar to people who are far outside of healthcare is what we see in retail, where brick and mortar stores were already troubled business models, were already troubled by competition from online shopping. And I would say COVID-19 in that case accelerated that trend in many ways and just put the final nail in the coffin in many brick and mortar business models. And I think that, without overstating it, I do think we're seeing some of the same in pharma, where there were already certain, as I said, embers that were burning in the industry. And what I've seen firsthand is, at least in a couple of the examples I've been involved with, COVID-19 is really just the fuel that we're throwing on top of that flame to really cause it to accelerate a trend that already pre-existed COVID-19 in the first place. So I'll call out a couple of those categories. I think the first has been in the area, first and most obviously, I think in the area of regulatory reform. We're very different from most innovative industries in that every step of the regulated process, of the development process, is regulated. So many people, of course, are well versed with the fact that FDA or EMA at the end of the process has to approve a product before it's marketed. That's well known. I think what the layperson often forgets is it's not just that. It's when you go from preclinical testing to phase 1, when you go from phase 1 to phase 2, the advice on the design of a phase 2 proof of concept study is often advice, but for all intents and purposes may as well be a mandate as well. I think that what we have seen in this crisis, and we, like many companies, have had the privilege of developing a medicine for COVID-19. Speaking for our company, I have never seen a faster responsiveness from FDA. We've put over 45 medicines or so into development over the last 6 years. I've never seen faster responsiveness from FDA than in the case of our therapeutic for severe COVID-19 patients, in our case, targeting the cytokine storm. And I think that has prompted a conversation that we see at our company, at other companies, and I believe at the regulator as well. I've had some dialogue with senior folks at FDA and heard other companies experience dealing with FDA too, in that there's now a conversation ongoing about, well, gee, COVID-19 is really important for us to have addressed with that sense of urgency. But I guess at its core, why is it so different than a number of other prevalent diseases that are putting pressure on our healthcare system every day, ranging from neurodegenerative diseases to cardiometabolic diseases, which certainly account for many more deaths and which don't have an epidemic feature to them, but are really no less pressing. And in a certain way, the changes that we have seen in the way that we have accelerated and expedited the drugs into development for COVID-19 could easily be replicated with some of the same risk-benefit trade-offs in other areas as well. And I think about 2 weeks ago, Stephen Hahn, the commissioner of FDA here in the US, made comments roughly to that effect, which I think would have been the subject of controversy had they been made 6 months ago pre-COVID. But I think now, having seen that experience and work in action, get people comfortable with ongoing review of protocols even while they're in development and so forth. So I think that's on the regulatory side. I think the same is true in pharma as well. There's a cultural change in terms of thinking about the speed of starting a study. Once you put a protocol in place, how many different sites do you have to go to get buy-in before you start that site? The speed of the responsiveness you expect from those sites, the collaboration speed across different pharma companies or a pharma company and a CRO. Again, going back to the COVID study example, again, I have never seen, putting the FDA and regulators to one side, even the dynamic between supplier, between site, between CRO, between the company and ourselves as a sponsor. I've never seen a faster interplay. But again, you look at getting that done in a matter of weeks, what would have ordinarily taken many months. There's no excuse for that not to be happening every day on other trials for important medicines that have nothing to do with COVID either. And I think that insight is too obvious to have passed notice. So I think there are those cultural features. I think from a technology perspective, and maybe we can come back in the Q&A, but I'll label a couple of these points. And Thomas, you can sort of say where you want to go in more detail. I think the rise of adaptive trials is something that we have seen in the context of COVID studies that I think is going to have a spillover effect, positive externality on other studies, receptiveness to adaptive studies going forward. I think we've seen acceleration and improvement in site monitoring. So not for drugs being developed for COVID, but ordinarily you have to send a nurse or a clinical research assistant out to a physical site, fly on a plane, go do a site visit to make sure that the data is being recorded in the right way, to report any deviations, in protocol so that those adjustments are made. That can be a multi-week process. Trials that were ongoing around the world without the ability to facilitate travel to sites physically found other ways to do it by phone, to be able to put in place new protocols. I think those are going to be here to stay as well in terms of innovative approaches to trial monitoring. I think with respect to drug discovery, we are going to see a lot of people, even if they were essential businesses, didn't necessarily send their people into labs. And I think when you have a lot of lab scientists who are sitting at home, I think for the first time, it's something that has been on deck for them to get around to, but they haven't gotten around to thinking about how you use AI applied to drug discovery. It was almost a cultural trend that when you have a bunch of bench scientists who are sitting at home, you finally have them, okay, I'm going to get around to thinking about what this in silico drug design is all about, engaging with computational chemistry platforms, including from third-party companies, from even smaller health tech companies. I think we've seen greater engagement in the last few months where people are doing it via Zoom rather than when they're showing up at their normal workspace with a wet lab. And then the last two trends I would call out that we can plant the seed for and kind of go into much greater depth in the Q&A is a trend towards greater data sharing, where it's something that the pharma industry has talked about for a long time. But in the context of COVID in particular, both in the case of therapeutics and vaccines, companies were able to come together really quickly to say, it doesn't make sense to have 7 drugs of this particular mechanism in a time of need. Let's figure out which one's the best and advance it. Let's think about what are the different vaccines in development, where are we duplicating efforts, and where do we need to redouble. And I have personally never seen that level of coordination before across companies, but I think COVID-19 necessitated it. I think we're going to see more of that in drug classes where there's overlapping research going forward. And then the final point I would make is back to a sort of a cultural point where I have seen, certainly at our company, I think the same is probably true at other companies. I'd be curious to hear from you, Haseeb, a greater sense of mission in the pharma industry and for the people who work in the pharma industry, where I think people are I've never seen them more proud of what they do, which in a certain sense is, again, ought not be specific to COVID-19. COVID-19 is something that's definitely been an important century-defining health event, but there are other century-defining health events that deserve no less attention and certainly no less pride for working on problems ranging from Alzheimer's disease to diabetes and obesity. And I think that in the public dialogue, certainly from a U.S. perspective, I'd be curious if you're seeing the same in the UK, Haseeb, but from the U.S. perspective, this is an election year. There was no doubt that in the summer of 2020, the thing we would be talking about as it related to pharma was drug pricing. that was destiny. It was sort of written on the wall, happens every 4 years, and certainly this year more than any other. And interestingly, I think the public dialogue around pharma today, and even within the industry, isn't some sort of self-reflective journey about drug pricing. It's a self-reflective journey about how we can be more innovative and more productive and get medicines to patients who need them even faster. And the thing that everyone wants more than anything out of the pharma industry right now isn't a drug pricing reform. It's a therapeutic or a vaccine for COVID-19 so that everyone can return back to normal life. And I think that too will, at least for a period of time, I predict, outlive the pandemic and our resolution of it itself. So those are a couple themes of trends that I see outliving the pandemic, but which were in some sense catalyzed by the pandemic.
That's very interesting. And I think let's go through some of your points that you make and let Haseeb also react to that, and just ask you to make some short answers as we have 10 minutes left. I think the first, let's take one of the very interesting points, which was about drug discovery, right? So we speak about AI, like AI is always the big trend, like AI is going to accelerate drug discovery. And really there is always these two sides of AI, acceleration or augmentation. But on the drug discovery, it's like we're going to make like 6 years to 6 days to find new drugs. And today we're kind of like all wondering, where are these drugs to treat COVID-19 built by AI, right? So today my question is, maybe it's too soon, we need quantum computers, maybe the technologies are not good enough, or maybe just the data to train the models are not here, because the best data will be the molecular libraries from Pharma, which is very private. So today for you, and really as your deep feeling, is AI better than a very good chemist to find new drugs?
So maybe you want me to take that one, Haseeb?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so,
I might talk a little bit about the data, but you can talk about the AI specifically.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I think that it depends on what part of the cycle you're talking about. Sometimes, I guess, think about drug discovery. I'll oversimplify it to make the point. You first want to identify targets in the body that are worth hitting with a drug. And then the second piece is designing a drug to hit that particular target. Okay, so you could think about it as a question. First is a question of biology. The second is a question of chemistry. I think that we're going to see, if you ask me, I predict we're going to see AI, machine learning, computational prowess. We can leave the subpart distinctions to one side. Computational capabilities, I would say, supersede human capabilities sooner in the realm of chemistry, in the realm of drug design and predicting what drugs ought to bind to which biological targets, than we will in elevating a particular biological target, above others, where I think that the human understanding of the interplay between different biological systems, the history of understanding why certain drugs were difficult to target, I think they're going to have more of a hypothesis generation role in the case of biology and target identification, in a way that kind of isn't required for chemistry and chemical design optimization. So, I think that doesn't answer your question with the clean AI is going to defeat humanity.
It's an open question, but it's very interesting to wonder, because today I think everybody was expecting some molecules to get out very fast, some molecules that would penetrate better in tissues, in the lungs, for example. And I think it's there is, as you say, many sides of it, but it's a very important question. And the second point that you made very clear, also the data sharing. When you want to train AI, you need access to really good data. With Owkin, we are orchestrating a project called Melody, when 10 large pharma are sharing intelligence on the molecular libraries without sharing the data. And this is really about the future of how the data will be held within the pharma company. So Novartis is building the first side of the data for pharma is how can I regroup my own data within the company for the clinical trials? And I really want to have Haseeb opinion on that, because Novartis is building this data lake 42, just regrouping your own data for clinical trials. This is not easy, because usually with CROs and everywhere. The second side is how can I, what data should I need to develop better drugs? And if you want to develop better drugs, there is the data that are being shared today, mostly for pricing. But how can you really use data that are fit for AI to really make progresses? They're not really the data you buy when you want to price a drug with companies such as Clozel Health, for example. So really, what's the data strategy? And the last thing is this data strategy sustainable? Because data, we're not always sure who it belongs to. If you do a CT scan in France, right, in a hospital that is public, does the CT scan belong to you, or does it belong to the French government? No one even knows. So all this data sharing paradigm and algorithm finally is kind of complex and pretty hard to know. So maybe Haseeb, you can tell us I don't know what you're feeling, but you're feeling that the data aggregation and this data strategy are going to be more and more clear within the pharma industry, and we're going to hear the word data more in the future for every kind of.
Yeah, so I think, from my vantage point, if I look at the projects that I'm exposed to and what I see and the people that I speak to, there's no question that when it comes to AI, we've made huge progress in the last 5 years. In the last 3 years as a company, and also within the UK, actually, I think there's been huge progress that's been made in terms of knitting together and curating different complex data sets. But many of the projects we work in, the big barrier is still that data integration and curation of data still seems to be a barrier. So the AI technology may be very, very strong, but the challenge is actually just with the validity of the data. And we're still kind of scrubbing and cleaning data that perhaps we thought we would have done earlier. Maybe just the other thing, to add is with all the advancements that we can have within artificial intelligence, the human body biology, we are just complex adaptive systems, and we in ourselves are very unpredictable. So you can have all the machine learning or artificial intelligence, but kind of human biology in itself can be very unpredictable, and history isn't always a good predictor of what may happen in the future.
Yeah.
So I think scientists will still have a role to play.
Yeah, and that can go also in the future of clinical trials. So speaking a lot about Vivek was speaking about the adaptative trials and the rise of adaptative trials. However, we heard about adaptative trials for the last 40 years, kind of, or a little bit less, and it's quite hard to accelerate. So what do you think Vivek is missing to accelerate clinical trials? What type of innovation is still needed? And you, with Roivant, have a lot of clinical trials ongoing with different molecules very successfully. But what do you think is the technologies of the future that will accelerate drug development and help define the right subgroups? Also, what the technologies are still needed to be more efficient for the drug development processes?
Sure. So, I think I'll go in order of importance. I think the most important input into reducing the time and cost of drug development is the actual effect sizes of the drugs themselves. So if you have a drug that's much more efficacious, it takes a smaller sample size and a therefore more rapidly conducted trial in order to demonstrate that effect. So I think that's where the revolution, including through the use of AI as applied to drug discovery, computational chemistry, et cetera. That's what that revolution is all after, is finding more effective drugs. That's at the top of the list, of course. But put that to one side. For a given drug that enters a human clinical trial, and I think this is the spirit of your question, what are sort of the steps to further compress the development timeline for that drug? Now, the answer, I think, the good news and the bad news is I think that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that doesn't rise to the level of brilliant trial design and adaptive trials, although I'll get to that in a second. But actually is lower-hanging fruit in terms of just what I would call the operational hurdles with running a clinical trial. How long it takes to get a site up and running, ready to be enrolling patients in that study is, I think today is objectionable. I mean, it's offensive how long it takes from the time that a regulator has gone through and reviewed all of the steps of a protocol, et cetera, including from patient safety standpoint, that you then go through that same review at the institutional review board at every single site that's kind of in some cases replicating the review that's already been done in the front end by a centralized regulator at the level of a country. And then there's just the logistics of coordinating between, often now you have contract manufacturers and you have CROs, each of whom are playing overlapping but different roles in getting getting drug to site, and then site trained, and then the physician at site getting it to patients. And so one of the things I commented on with respect to what COVID did, at least in the last few months, is just from the standpoint of cultural urgency and need, we just saw a lot of that coordination taking place in a much more facile way, not having to do with the use of technology at all. So I think that was I think I think, going to have a much bigger impact than the use of adaptive trial designs as it pertains to speed. I'll come to that in a second. So I think that that's something that, the willingness to adopt relatively simple technology. For example, we built a piece of technology at one of our, technology subsidiary companies that enabled, called Owkin, which enabled more real-time monitoring of data that was already in the process of being collected in a clinical trial. So here you have many companies that had their trials interrupted by COVID. But if you're able to get information in real time about which sites are most likely to have been impacted and interrupted and which sites weren't, you could potentially redirect patient flow and your enrollment numbers to the sites that weren't going to be as impacted by COVID as to the sites who were. But if you were able to make that decision within a couple weeks versus normally taking a data feed that follows a normal protocol of coming in every couple of months, that could make all the difference for trial continuity in the case of a global pandemic. Well, it turns out that even if you don't have a global pandemic, that kind of information is really useful to be able to optimize, which sites are doing well and which sites aren't, to be able to get that information in real time over the course of a normal study anyway. And I think that's actually relatively low-hanging fruit. It's not technological. It's not cutting-edge technological innovation. It's relatively basic application of technology that already exists, but you kind of have to have the willingness of trial sponsors, of trial sites, of CROs to adopt that technology. And I think that that's something that, I hope we're going to see more of based on people's experience in the case of COVID, but I think is something that's actually lower hanging fruit. And then you get to the more advanced stuff like adaptive trial designs. But actually, I think that there's much lower hanging fruit that's easier to pick off before you have to work your way up to sort of, I think some of the statistical trade-offs and uncertainty trade-offs that come with adaptive trials, which I'm a big fan of, but I actually think that it's a bit of a straw man to think that that's the rate limiting variable to reducing the time and cost of conducting clinical studies.
Thanks for the answer. Very interesting. We start to have questions from the crowd. If I may, I'm going to ask the questions and one of you can take it. I'll let you choose. So we have a question from Vernon Bainton, who is Chief Medical Officer at Avas Links Group. He's asking the question, healthcare will never be the same due to digital transformation catalyzed by COVID-19. Considering some of the successes, big or small, you've seen gaining traction, what has surprised, inspired you the most? And conversely, what unexpected challenges have arisen? I think we've been a bit through that. Maybe, Haseeb, you want something else on that?
I could take a shot at it. One is COVID specific. And one is not COVID specific, but it's just happened in the last couple of years, I think, with this kind of data revolution that we're going through. So COVID specifically, I think Vivek kind of mentioned it. Under the current kind of emergency measures, if you like, I think I've just been blown away by how progressive and pragmatic regulators have been. So within the framework of regulation is there for a reason, we need to maintain high standards. I think what they've done is, with various processes which are normally done sequentially, they've started doing things in parallel, being much more progressive and pragmatic. So I think that's been a huge positive. For that to remain, however, is going to require, because it's all public bodies, it's going to require public consultations and a significant amount of bureaucratic work to embed that within the system. The second part of the question, sorry, if you just remind me, was what surprised me.
Yeah, surprised you. Right? Yeah, or inspired you the most, and what conversely?
So the inspired was the regulator. Yeah, the challenge actually is, and it kind of relates a little bit to what Vivek was saying, with the opportunity that I think we have through this kind of technological kind of advancements that we're seeing pre, peri, and post-COVID. We have the potential with the democratization of clinical trials to do these larger studies to potentially larger populations. And I think that's great. That's a great opportunity, but the big challenge is from a payer side. So just as a conceptual level, whereas before you may have been able to do a study in a small population and demonstrate high efficacy, that from a payer perspective would have been able to demonstrate, you could show high cost effectiveness in a small group and the overall budget impact would be small. Now you may show moderate to high efficacy in a much bigger group. That doesn't help you demonstrate the value with the existing health technology kind of processes that most federal healthcare systems have today. And obviously leads to a bigger budget impact. So you can draw in the clinical trials, you can do the bigger studies, you can get good data, but you may be ending up coming up with a solution that the system can't take. So there needs to be real joined up thinking on this one.
Yeah. I'm just coming back to some of the points you made before, both of you. It's about collaboration between pharma. You know that today, I think like pharma are more willing to collaborate on COVID-19, on the trials, sharing insights without sharing the data. That's what about federated learning is, as they do in the Melody project, for example. But do you really feel like there's other diseases that are ill understood, and it's going to be one of the topics of today's session is really about glioblastoma, brain tumor. No one really get it. All the trials are failing. Alzheimer's, of course, maybe one trial is not failing, but so at the end, it's like literally, do you really feel that today pharma are really more willing to collaborate through technologies, or just really like they understand the need to share insights, if they're not sharing data, to build new collective intelligence and be better? Do you really feel there was a difference with this COVID time, or you feel it was always before this COVID period that pharma are more willing to be open in terms of collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, I think the trend had begun before, and I think that COVID has been a clear accelerant. Where I think a lot of the arguments that you could make internally for how you would do it better or in a more respectful manner of company competitive interests kind of were thrown out the window. And I think once you change norms, that's a one-way ratchet. So I think that in a certain sense, it was in the direction of what everyone's been talking about for a long time. But I do think that there was a palpable change during COVID-19, just in terms of, I mean, even in terms of just responsiveness of, companies to one another, in terms of breaking down and willingness to just sort of say, okay, let's just sort of dissolve the silo and tell you what we're learning and we'll do the same. How can we work together? I think we've seen a lot more of that spirit in the last few months than we would have previously, even though that would have been the intention previously as well.
I would agree with that. I think this kind of reframing of what is competitive versus pre-competitive is giving a lot greater clarity to that.
Perfect. And I'll hand it back to Jack in 2 minutes for the conclusion of this session. But I'll just ask one question of both of you. If you had like $20 million, $100 million to create your own startup today, to build the future of pharma, you have an idea? What would you both, of course, very successful and done a lot of things. What would you do? In what field would you be? Would you be the data field? Would you try to build AI for drug development? Or what would you, like Science 37, going to monitoring trials at home? What's the field and the vertical you would invest? Just tell me in one word, both of you. And then I'll go back to Jack.
Yeah, maybe I'll go first. And I say this, it's probably slightly different to what Vivek's answer will be. I think if you look at the thesis of where is the ineffectiveness and the inefficiency within healthcare, most of it's around clinical and patient behavioral change. And I think that there are many other people I think can work in the discovery and development space. But I think there's an untapped opportunity in being a partner on actually getting these technologies adopted through using kind of clinical behavioral change methodology. So I'd kind of invest there.
Yeah. I think it is broadly computational chemistry replacing medicinal chemistry as the heart of pharmaceutical R&D. So
makes sense. Thanks to both of you for this very interesting topic. Jack, over back to you.
Thomas, thank you very much for moderating this super interesting discussion. I'm always I haven't met Haseeb before, but thank you very much, Haseeb. Your insight is, I think, if we had more people like you in the industry, maybe we will have moved things on a little bit quicker. But certainly, I think what's happened is we have seen this. These events unfold and catalyze a lot of what we have wanted to do, but were strapped down by kind of inertia and red tape. I personally see this as a no turning back acceleration in the way to do things right, and the pessimism and kind of caution has been thrown out the window. We're seeing the results. I personally think that the way in which we've also collaborated between different previously competing companies has also been really fantastic. to see as well. So thank you, Haseeb. Vivek, as ever, great to hear you, and congratulations on all the things that have unfolded for you in the last 12 months since we saw each other. So appreciate your time, everybody. We will now take a short networking break and be back in 10 minutes' time for a fireside chat with me and my dear friend, Dr. Alex Kumar, global health doctor, photographer, first in the world, I think, who does both. And we will welcome you back as soon as we're ready to go in about 10 minutes' time. All the very best.